Hey everybody, Tag Life Done Free. Hey, today I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Starve the Beast. Today we're going to take a hard look at why we obey. Why do we do the things that we do, right? How is it that we allow that type of control over us? So if you're interested in how we obey, if you're interested in why we do it, come on, let's check it out. How is it that governments around the world are somehow justified in the actions that no individuals are allowed to take? Governments demand our homage in the form of taxes, and only they get to decide what they consumed and purchased. They get to decide what to regulate and how to restrict voluntary trades and transactions. They spy on our records, our conversations. They place limits on our speech under the guise of misinformation. They and they alone are the arbitrator of truth. They drop bombs and perform assassinations. They force us through economic warfare to fight in their stead. And if we disagree or refuse, they lock us up and take our freedom. And if you insist, they'll take your life. Why is it that unjust acts like murder, fraud, and coercion are morally accepted and applauded when they're performed by the state? But if an individual does it, it's evil. Why do we award politicians and bureaucrats special moral status? This is the problem with political authority. Ask yourself, is political authority legitimate? Can murder, coercion, and lawfare be justified? See, our normalcy bias allows us to believe that our rulers should be allowed to operate outside the bounds of morality, but yet confines you and I. This is what is referred to as the social contract. This is based on the idea that there is a contractual relationship between the government and the governed. The government provides services like rule of law, and the citizens pay for it and must obey. This is not reality. Did you sign the contract? Because I certainly did not. Did you give your consent? Now, before you say no, experts agree that this is implicit consent and not explicit consent that contractually bonds you to the state. Implicit consent is consent granted through one's conduct rather than through written or verbal communication. Now, there are several ways to grant implicit consent. Passive consent is when you agree to the proposal by just simply not opposing it. Can you imagine, right? Can you think of anywhere else where this would hold weight? Most common in our world is consent by acceptance. You accept the terms when you accept the services. Medicare, Medicaid, road and bridge. These are all things that confirm, your acceptance or your acceptance to the deal. Does this sound like a valid contract to you? Are you familiar with the word criterion? See, it's a standard in which judgment or decisions may be based. Implicit consent fails to legitimize the political authority as they violate a basic criterion for a valid contract. This criterion requires that each party have a reasonable way to reject a proposed agreement. If there's no way that one party can express dissent, then it's not actually a contractual relationship, but one of servitude or bondage. If you agree between you and the state, none of these forms of consent offer a way to reject the deal. The bottom line is that everyone knows that the state will force you to comply whether you agree or not. The last form assumes you consent by just simply not leaving, right? I mean, governments, they assume your consent because you continue. You've heard it, right? Love it or leave it. See, because the option to leave is available to you, the powers say that you agree. This is not to mention that economic slavery that prevents many of us from leaving. Anyway, I digress. Because you have a way of rejecting the deal, leading scholars say this is a contract. You following so far? How can you be expected to give up your property, leave your job, your family in order to show you disagree with the contract? When this is brought up, they always say that it's the will of the majority that gives consent. Popular vote, anyone? Right, said another way, unanimous consent. Is it ethical for a group of people to force their will only because they have a statistical advantage? Right? Democracy, democracy. Two wolves and a sheep asking what's for dinner. Let's say a bunch of us, homesteaders go to an auction and the majority agree that you and you alone should pay the bill for the purchases that day. And because it's the majority, it's consent, right? Are you morally obligated because the majority said so? This is why the Bill of Rights must exist, because without it, the mob would rule. How is it then that the majority can grant the government an exception from morality? Right? They do it under the guise of, national security, climate change, and, the greater good for all. These are things they use to manipulate us into agreeing to their contracts. Weapons of mass destruction, terrorist sales, and nuclear weapons, right? We must have the Patriot Act, right? Dissension from their arbitrary rule will surely get you into a concentration camp or worse, right? Remember, they are the moral authority. Now, some are going to argue that the benefits that arise from granting a government a special moral status are significant enough to warrant the cost of obedience. So, how would you measure if a government is beneficial to its people? Because, there's Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and others murdered many of their citizens under this moral authority. Now, whether or not the government is in fact beneficial to a society, as there's no clear objective or criteria that can measure the total cost and benefits of a government. Furthermore, there are many examples of governments who operate in ways that were clearly negative to their society, as I mentioned ago with Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Now, many will argue that the benefits of the government clearly outweigh the cost of its obedience, and if this is true, it still doesn't justify the implied moral superiority assumed by them. Is it okay to murder and to assassinate and to do those things because you have some implied authority? I don't think so. And if simply providing benefits gives you, a moral superiority, then what stops an association or a club? They should be able to claim the same right if they can provide substantial benefits. Have we, already awarded Musk and, Walton this authority by our implied consent of using their services? Most would say it's obvious that only a government can be elevated to the status of moral authority. It's common for most people to believe in the legitimacy of political authority. That is because of the cognitive biases. These biases predispose you and me to obey the authority figures. We kind of convince ourselves that the powers that be are justified in the way they behave. It doesn't even matter whether or not it's moral or justified, or even if it hurts us. Do you think this is a coincidence? Do we behave just by chance, or are our brains set up this way? Have you ever heard of a status quo? Right? Everybody goes status quo, right? Status quo exists in our preference for safety and stability. Our fear of change encourages established customs and norms, even if they are immoral or dangerous. So why do societies accept customs then, right? Status quo is the answer. Do you know any customs from around the world that may seem immoral or absurd? Did you know that in Madagascar there's a tradition known as the turning of the bones, where people bring forth the bodies of their ancestors from the family crypts and rewrap them in fresh cloth, and they then dance with the corpses around the tomb to live music? Or the Dani tribe from New Guinea. The members of this tribe cut off their fingers as a way to display grief at funeral ceremonies. There are even countries that profess to their children that if they are not good, an old white man in a red suit will come down a chimney, not with gifts, but instead deliver them the dreaded lump of coal. From the outside looking in, these may seem peculiar and absurd. This status quo bias can be credited with why so many people can't bring themselves to question the political authority. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, I believed in the political authority, and I believed that it was legitimate. We're taught that obedience is moral, right? At a very early age, we're taught to move around by a bell, stand in line for our food. This then turns into we must have the new house, and did you see Jimmy got a new boat? Invest for the long term, they say, right? See, it's completely normal to grant moral superiority to agents of the state. This is an extremely prominent and fundamental feature of the structure of our society. Do you know what else is normal? No matter where we are from, most people have a strong need to believe that some governments, and especially their own governments, do have this moral authority. There must be more to this, right? Have you ever heard of cognitive dissonance? Have you ever had where you had two or more beliefs that conflicted with each other? This is cognitive dissonance. If we praise someone who is immoral, this gets us into this weird, uncomfortable position. How can we support something that conflicts with our moral view? The system helps us with this dilemma by providing the never-ending stream of fear. We rationalize ourselves because of the other person or group was a bad guy or a bad group. Right? Terrorists, an axis of evil, communists, and dictators. We can take that land because we must fight climate change with clean energy. We can bomb them with morality because we are told that they hurt innocents. They deserve this treatment, right? I mean, just imagine how many kids wouldn't have to die if we just monitors everyone's cell phones. We are forced to pay taxes to fund immoral policies. That's right, you pay for it, right? We drop bombs on innocents. We imprison people for crimes that have no victim. We justify and satisfy our dissidents by giving legitimacy to the political authority. This is consent. This morality obligates us to obey, even if we suffer from our own compliance. Most modern societies have submitted to the will of their governments, even when that will requires actions that they themselves would never perform. How many of you have paid very large amounts of money to the state in satisfaction of its taxation demands? And how do we explain to ourselves why we obey? It's simple. We do it because we fear. We fear punishment. And this drives towards the social conformity. Is it really as simple as a status quo or a cognitive dissonance? Well, not so fast. Have you ever heard of Stockholm Syndrome? In 1973, Jan Erik Olsson, a convict on parole, took 4 employees, 3 women and a man, hostage during a failed bank robbery. They held the hostages captives for 6 days in one of the bank's vaults. And when the hostages were released, none of them would testify against either of the captors in court. Instead, they began raising money for their defense. During their experience, they developed a special bond with their captor. Stockholm Syndrome is now used to refer to a psychological phenomenon where individuals under the control of a powerful person or group develop positive feelings towards them. They want to please them, and in some cases it has been shown that the imprisoned will actually defend the actions of their captors. It is an unconscious defense mechanism that focuses on survival. There's an interesting dynamic between the hostages and the captor and the citizen and the state. Our well-being in 2025 is increasingly dependent on our willingness to just simply behave. One way to show our obedience is to simply identify with our state. And they make this much, much easier when they give you the simple choice of red or blue. When we pledge our allegiance to the Republicans or Democrats, we also pledge our allegiance to the state. Again, giving consent. We adopt their perspective and we develop emotional bonds with any person or group that we can say is ours. Most people deny or even minimize the action of their party, group, or association. It's for national security. People are dying. We are hurting the planet, right? Ring a bell. I pledge allegiance to the... Never mind, I digress. None of these explanations is emotionally satisfying, and most would prefer the explanation that we obey because we are conscientious and caring citizens. We choose to make great sacrifices to do our duty and serve our society. We must, however, recognize that features of the human mind predispose each and every one of us to accept and conform to the legitimacy of political authority. These theories attempt to justify this authority, but are at best weak. We should be motivated to take a more skeptical view of the government, because if the authority of the state is legitimate, it would not follow unmoral laws. I do not believe in a world without rule of law. There are laws that correspond to the moral principles. These laws, natural laws, are independent of the state's authority. Don't cheat, steal, and kill, and these laws should be obeyed regardless of the form of rule. There are laws that you should obey not because the state says, but instead because you are an independent, moral, and sovereign person. We don't not steal because we want to be obedient to the state. We don't steal because it's unjust. This is not a political obligation, this is a moral obligation. Skepticism of political authority is duty to yourself. The more people who adopt this attitude, the better. Since the dawn of history, more people have been imprisoned, more people have been forced into poverty, and more people have been killed due to obedience, not disobedience. Hundreds of millions of people lost their lives fighting for a statist agenda, and hundreds of millions of more died at the hands of a totalitarian regime. We need more and more people who will question the political authority, heroes who stand ready to practice peaceful, civil disobedience. And when politicians issue commands that are immoral or opposed to a flourishing free society. The critical claim that this attitude will throw society into a state of chaos. The picture of ordinary people just waiting, for disorder, waiting for an excuse to run rampant and disregard the law and order and, pillage and steal, flies in the face of everything we know. But I assure you, the average human being is far more likely to commit serious crimes in the name of obedience to authority than he or she is to rashly disobey justified commands of their own morality. When it comes to the ultimate tool of compliance, imagine, if you will, our willingness to obey being based on an intellectual authority, a being so smart that our human brains cannot comprehend the solutions offered. They say that absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. So imagine being scared and you have someone guiding you that is so smart that they can create your reality. They can predict, they can analyze the future, right? And they can do this at levels that humans cannot. Imagine being psyoped that we can no longer separate rhetoric or action. Or, as Whitney Webb points out, AI basically states that the real promise from AI, from their perspective, is a tool of perception and manipulation, that eventually people will not be able to interpret or perceive reality without the help of an AI via cognitive diminishment and learned helplessness. For that to happen, online reality must become so insane that the real people can no longer distinguish real from fake in the virtual realm, so that they can then become dependent on certain algorithms to tell them what is real. Please, 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 we are in a war against the elites over human perception. And that social media is the major battleground of that war. Hold on to your critical thinking and skepticism, and we must never, ever surrender. But at the end of the day,